Paul Lucas worked at GlaxoSmithKline, a huge international pharmaceutical company, for 25 years. 16 of those years, he was the CEO and president. He retired in 2012, but recently he's been speaking out about Canada's seemingly inability to produce vaccines at home or deliver them properly. The list of crises grows every single day. So we've reached out to Mr. Lucas to see if he can help us understand what's going on a little better. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
It's good to be here, Pamela.
Why can't we there's so many questions, but why can't we get enough vaccine? What do you think is at the root of it?
Well, as you know, I wrote an article for the Financial Post and kind of hypothesized about why we're in the situation we're in. And I think, Canadians need to understand that, there's been a lot of noise around vaccines, a lot of diversions, but at the end of the day, the Canadian government ordered 6 million doses of vaccine between Moderna and Pfizer to be delivered between now and the end of March. And no matter what is done or said, that's what we're going to get, and nothing's going to change.
And we have 37 million people.
That's right. So we will be able to vaccinate 3 million people by the end of March at the earliest, because those may not actually be delivered till the end of March. So that's the situation we're in. And the good question is, why did we only order 6 million doses to the end of March? And that's the question I've been trying to get journalists to ask the Prime Minister. Because I think, it's unacceptable as to what's happened there.
The stories that we're seeing recently, the Globe and Mail's been doing some stories. Certainly Global News has been doing some stories. Going back to the beginning where, again, the flaw in the system was we were going to do a deal with the Chinese. And to make a very long story short, they reneged. And then we were kind of way back in the list of asking for and ordering vaccines from other producers.
Yeah, so Mr. Trudeau continues to say that, we were early negotiating contracts with pharmaceutical companies. And I have to be skeptical about that, because you'd have to ask the question if, Moderna says that we were the first ones to sign a contract with them, yet that was for 2 million doses between now and the end of March. So, yes, I think we wasted time at the beginning of this pandemic in negotiating contracts. We must have. And yes, the Canadian government focused on trying to find out how they could deliver domestic supply of a vaccine. And, they pursued the Chinese vaccine. They put money into Medicago. They put money into Vito. But the reality is none of those were viable, and they should have known that. They should have known that none of those organizations would be able to deliver a vaccine until late 2021, probably.
21. What we understand from the situation in my province at Vito Intervac in Saskatchewan is that, yes, they're building a facility, but the government is doling out the money on an annual basis. Well, you don't build a building one room at a time. You build a building so that you can either manufacture this or you can't.
And that's where the lack of foresight was in terms of ensuring that we had domestic vaccine capability. So if you go back to H1N1, when Glaxo had the contract.
You were president and CEO then in 2009, right?
In fact,
okay, go ahead.
I was integrally involved in delivering that vaccine. So we produced it, got it out. We were the only manufacturer. And at the end of that, we all sat down and said, okay, what did we learn from this? And one of the key learnings was we got to make sure for the next pandemic that we have domestic supply of vaccine and that we have more than one manufacturer.
Right.
Well, we didn't do it. We didn't follow up on that. And here's where we are.
Okay, so explain to us what happened in that situation. So you developed vaccine, you had a contract to develop a vaccine then for the next crisis, for pandemic readiness, if you will. How do you do that? Like, how do you prepare for a next crisis that you don't know what it is?
It's a very good question. And actually, public health and GlaxoSmithKline did a great job of preparing for that. So Glaxo had a contract with the federal government, public health, to produce a pandemic vaccine when needed. So you can't just build a plant and have it sit there empty and then wait for the pandemic and then make a vaccine. So what they did was Glaxo produced the annual flu vaccine.
Right.
And the Canadian government guaranteed us a certain portion of the national flu vaccine contract to make sure that the plant continued to run effectively. They also paid us a pandemic preparedness fee, which allowed us to maintain the facility, and we actually expanded it so that we would be ready. So that, and then the pandemic hit. I remember David Butler Jones contacted me and said, "It's here." We geared up, we produced the vaccine in a few months, and we vaccinated 40% of Canadians by the end of the year of 2009. So that all worked really well. We were fortunate in that situation and that it was the kind of vaccine that we could actually make. So, so that all worked well. But again, the problem this time around is that this is a very different virus. And as you know, the mRNA vaccine is very different than usual.
But where is that facility and where's that capability? I mean, could there not be work going on there?
At Glaxo, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, what I'm very disappointed about, and Canadians should be, is that the Canadian government, and this is part of the problem. The federal government, the Liberal governments, successive Liberal governments, have not had any relationship with the pharmaceutical industry. They decided. You were
kind of enemy number one back in. Yeah.
So there's no relationship there other than, as a regulator and they're a customer, and that's it. So, what should have been happening was that the federal government, public health, the health department should have been working with the pharmaceutical industry since 2009, the last pandemic, and saying, okay, what's happening with vaccine technology? What could vaccines of the future look like? What kinds of viruses could we encounter? And therefore, what kind of capability do we need? They would have talked to Glaxo, who has a plant in Quebec City. They would have talked to Sanofi, who has a plant in Toronto. And perhaps just with the two of them, developed a plan to ensure that we had the biological manufacturing capability that you need for mRNA vaccines, because that's not new technology.
Right.
It's existed in Canada for a while. We could have and should have been prepared for this.
This is just, I think, breathtaking for people who are sitting there wondering where this vaccine is ever going to come from. The fight, I don't want to get too diverted on this, but I mean, I remember this battle going back to the 1960s with the current prime minister's father over patent protection for drugs. And that was really the point. You guys were the bad guys because you wanted to keep your patents and protect it forever and make a bunch of money, and everybody wanted generic drugs and make it cheap and accessible, and the war unfolded.
Yeah, and I worked with government for 30 years of my career trying to get them to understand that was a failing strategy. And it took this long to prove I was right, but it was a failing strategy. The Trudeau government in 1968 passed compulsory licensing. Patents disappeared. You're not going to invest if you don't have protection for your intellectual property. The industry started disappearing very quickly. Mulroney got into power. He improved the patent laws. The industry actually started to reinvest, went from $100 million in R&D to $1 billion in R&D very quickly. Mm-hmm. But then it started to deteriorate again, and the federal government didn't live up to its side of the bargain. And that investment again started to deteriorate. And through the Chrétien years and onward, this Canada just was not a good place to invest for the pharma sector. And they chose.
So you go somewhere else if you're a company.
Yeah. Exactly. They went somewhere else, like the UK, like the US, like Europe. And we're not great friends in those places necessarily, but they have a good relationship that leads to the kind of success on vaccines that we have today.
So we're hearing now about this Ontario company that's going to have a manufacturing facility in Alberta. What's the timeline on that?
Well, yeah, this is Providence you're talking about, I think, is it? Yeah. So they came out of the woods yesterday, I guess. And I mean, they're a startup company. They say they've got technology, the mRNA technology, that they can produce a vaccine. But the reality is they're just starting phase one. That means they have no hope of having an approved vaccine. Probably they don't have any hope before the end of this year.
Yeah. And they also said that they couldn't get their phone calls returned, and whether it was government or the media to say, hey, we're here, at least we're trying.
Yeah, and I think that's another example, and I don't know what the real situation is with that company, but I think that's another thing. I mean, the Canadian government, the feds just, the innovation minister, outgoing, and his predecessors spent no time talking with the pharmaceutical sector, no time trying to understand the life sciences industry. Perhaps if they had, they would have known about Providence. They would have known about this other company that says they could have produced a vaccine. So, and the veto story is an interesting one, as is Medicago, because both of those organizations should have been funded a long time ago by the federal government, and they didn't do it. They poured some money into veto, but not the kind of money that you need to actually produce 60 million vaccines in 3 months.
Actually, walk us through some of that. Why this is, as you say, new technology, the Pfizer and the Moderna, based on a different way of attacking the virus. When we see now the discussion about, and the provinces have been, trying to figure out what to do, whether they give everybody one shot of what they've got and hope for the best. The numbers are about 50% protection, or whether they hold back that second dose and try and do, everybody the right way and make that 21-day window. But then all of a sudden the 21-day window became a 27-day, and now it's 45. And it's kind of all the way through this. We've seen wear masks, don't wear masks. 21 days is important. Oh, now 45 will work. How are we supposed to figure out what's really true? Do you have any insight?
Well, I do have some, and I think again, the root of all of these issues around how long should the interval be, and the 6 doses versus 5, and all of that for Canada is completely due to the fact that we ordered so few vaccines till the end of March.
Yeah,
it's all due to that. And the reality is, I come from a pharma background where that industry is highly regulated. The approved dosing regimen for those vaccines is 3 weeks and 4 weeks for Pfizer and Moderna. In the US, if anybody in the industry suggested otherwise, they could go to jail. And in Canada, it is illegal to suggest that, it can be used in another way. Now, our public health people in Canada tend to be, they're pretty good, some of the thinkers, and they've come up with, well, we could move it to 42 days because some of the data in the clinical trials that were done suggests that you could do that. So that's probably acceptable. But you start pushing it to 60 days and 90 days and that sort of thing, you're really not doing it based on science. And I personally cannot support that.
It's a wing and a prayer.
Yeah, we have to administer that vaccine properly. And I'm sure that was part of the deal that Pfizer and Moderna made, is that, we'll sell you the vaccine, but you have to use this properly. You have to use it quickly, and you have to use it properly. So, well,
that's the thing. So if you're a provincial premier and you're sitting there, because they're the guys that are on the front line, right? Yeah. They have to make that decision. I mean, so in that situation, what do? Do you get at least some of it in arms across a province and hope and pray that the second round arrives, or do you hold it back?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I feel badly for the provinces because, they've taken flack, and the reality is that the problem is not at the provincial level, that it's the federal level. It took a while to get the logistics up and running, but they know how to do that now. So that's not an issue. But when it comes to the dosing regimen, I feel badly for them because they are stuck. So, but I think a couple of them, have taken a pragmatic approach, which is, look, we need to make sure we've got a second dose that we can administer within 42 days at the most. Quebec's gone even further than that.
Yeah.
But 42 days is really the stretch. You don't want to go any further than that. So the smart thing to do is prioritize the people who should get it, give them their first dose, but make sure you've got the second dose for them.
Yeah, and that's the problem. They were told they did, and now why is, this is another question people have, of course, is Pfizer just discovers in the middle of this that it's time to expand the plant. There was no existing other facilities where they could go, so there was no disruption in supply chain?
Yeah, I feel badly for Pfizer too, because Pfizer and Moderna have saved the world on this pandemic. I mean, that sounds like a strong statement, but
no, but it's, and this was Operation Warp Speed, and the Americans gave them a ton of money and said, solve this.
Yeah, and one of the reasons maybe why we don't have vaccine early is because we contributed nothing to the development of those vaccines. I mean, Mr. Trudeau says, well, we ordered a lot of vaccine and that helped the companies. That's not what they needed. They needed to minimize the risk up front, and speed through the system. And Warp Speed did that. It was actually run by the fellow who used to run Glaxo's vaccine development.
Oh, okay.
So he came from industry. Yeah. And he knows how to develop vaccines, and it worked. And we should have done the same thing, but we didn't do that. We always want to go to people that don't know anything about industry and don't know anything about vaccine development and put them in charge.
Well, this is, I guess I have to go to these stories that we've been reading about what is going on inside the Public Health Authority in Canada. And you have people putting their names to it. It's not, they're not hiding in the shadows, basically saying we've lost the expertise where we used to have people who were informed and had relationships with the industry and knew a little bit about science and epidemiology and all of these things. Now it's just become a place where we rotate through the regular everyday bureaucrat from some other department. One day they're working in transport and the next day they're working at, the Public Health Authority. This is really scary. Yeah,
that was shocking. That is shocking that they would do that. And as a result, they scrapped GFIN, which was the intelligence network,
right,
which could have prevented a lot of this around the pandemic. And I make the point that, we should have done so much better on this pandemic. And we made, the federal government made multiple mistakes. I asked the question, why couldn't we have been like Taiwan? Minimal impact. Now, people will say, well, Taiwan's small and it's an island. Well, right. We could be an island too. Close the borders down like the Atlantic Canada did,
right.
And they minimized the impact. But we didn't, the Liberal government scrapped GFIN. And therefore, we didn't know this was coming, and we got taken by surprise, and they acted too late. And
they got some warnings in December and January, but went, maybe it won't. And they were taking, I think, but you would know better than me, way too much advice from the WHO.
Yeah, I think that was part of the problem too, and I guess we'll find out one day what happened there with China and so on, what their influence was, but it was. We should not be in this situation. Canadians should be outraged that people are dying every day, that, businesses are closing every day. It didn't need to be this way. And the federal government of Canada needs to take accountability for that. And, Mr. Trudeau stands up there every day, and I'm not that political a guy, but, he stands up there every day, and it's almost propaganda now. We have the best vaccine program in the world. We did more deals than anybody else. We've got more, 6 times as much vaccine as we need as a country. And none
just
of that.
Not true.
Yeah, none of that is true. You just look at the facts and the data, and it isn't true. We don't have the best vaccine plan. Yes, we did 7 deals, but so did Europe, so did the UK, so did the US. we're no different than them.
And I guess it's not surprising. I mean, we talk about vaccine nationalism and what we're hearing out of the EU these days. Even fighting with Britain, obviously, but it really does look as if politics has infiltrated this. In our own country, nobody liked Trump. Nobody wanted to give him any credit. Nobody wanted to do any deals. Europeans are mad at Britain over Brexit. Like, unfortunately, millions of people are dying while we have these political battles.
Absolutely. And I've said all along, people have talked about the health impact of this and the economic impact of it, but there's also a major political story here. And, what I see in Canada, because that's what I tend to focus on particularly, is that, for Mr. Trudeau, he knows that this is the one issue that stands in the way of his majority government this year. And he will say just about anything to try and divert attention from it, to try and get the message out that we're just in great shape. But the reality is that we are 3 to 4 months behind where we should be. That's 3 to 4 months of more deaths, more shutdowns, more economic damage, more social and mental damage. And as I said, somebody needs to take accountability for that. I wish someone in the federal government would stand up and say, yeah, we messed up. They'll never do that. I think I know what happened with this. I've hypothesized what the various reasons are, and it's something to do with the relationship with the industry. It's something to do with when they actually started negotiating contracts. It's something to do with the fact that Canada contributed nothing to the development. But I think part of it is they got approval earlier than they expected, and they didn't plan for that scenario. I think that they thought that they were going to get approval for vaccines here in Canada in the first quarter of 2021, not in December. Right. And, but any thinking person would have said, okay, well, we've got that scenario, therefore we need this much vaccine. What if we get approval in the fourth quarter of 2020? In that case, we need this much vaccine by this time. And they didn't do that.
Yeah, that seems pretty obvious.
Yeah. So, I think journalists particularly, and I've been frustrated by the fact that they have not done this, is press Mr. Trudeau on why do we not have more than 6 million vaccines by the end of March?
Yeah, I mean, this is, we're in 12 months into this pandemic, any way you cut it, even though some of the information was there earlier, and we have vaccinated under 2% of Canada's population.
That's right.
Just that fact alone is disturbing, frightening, and, depressing.
It is. And you look at what's happening in the U.S., the vaccine is flowing like crazy. And of course, in Canada, we like to say, well, we're doing much better than them. Well, the U.S. is booming right now with vaccine. And they'd like to have more, but, lots of people are getting back. They're vaccinated. They vaccinated 1.6 million people the other day.
Well, it was interesting, even with the new president, Biden, who was promising, 100 million vaccines in 100 days. And the head of the CDC said, that's what we're doing right now.
I know. Yeah.
And then a journalist did sort of say, could you step up your game a little bit? Because the numbers are...
Yeah, and Biden did. He added another 50%.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is a little behind where they said they wanted to be. Yeah. They said they would vaccinate 20 million people by the end of December, and they vaccinated 20 million people by this week. So they're about 3 weeks behind where they wanted to be. So. Yeah.
Which is better than 4 or 5 months or 6 months. You raised an interesting point because, we are where we are now. So the question is, can we learn, will we learn from these situations and figure out what to do next? So I was reading something yesterday that, it's kind of obvious, but it just troubled me. The long-term consequences of school closures and remote learning on social and cognitive development. It's not just that they might be behind in their school year. It's just that the young mind at that point grows at a certain rate. And if it develops at a certain rate, and if that's somehow stopped, we see it as a result of poverty or any number of other things. We've got that situation. We've got businesses that will never reopen, mom and pop shops that, two-man bands. They can't survive this. They may or may not have been eligible for government programs, but they just won't. People are now ordering everything online and buying from the big box because it's the only thing that's open. It seems we had such a short-term perspective on this right from the beginning. We didn't even imagine that this might last a year.
Yeah, and I just keep coming back to the point that, Canadians should be outraged. We should not be in this position. We should be in a much better position than we are. It's crazy, but Canadians, I get frustrated with a lot of Canadians because they sit there and say, oh, yeah, okay, well, that's fine. We're a little behind, but
it's good enough.
Yeah, we're losing 100 people a day. In the country. So, it's extremely frustrating that we are where we are. And coming back to the learnings issue, I shake my head because I was around for SARS. I was involved in SARS. I was directly involved in H1N1. And both times we said, okay, we're going to take the learnings, we're going to apply it for the future. And we didn't.
I don't think I certainly can't get past the notion that we took all those existing stockpiles of PPE and threw it out.
I know.
For a short-term budget, like, we save $50,000 here or $100,000, and then we're left with nothing.
Yeah, I was involved in that. We talked about the national stockpile, emergency stockpile after H1N1 and how it was important to keep that up. And, we needed a supply of antivirals and we needed a supply of PPE and we needed to make sure we had domestic vaccine production and so on and so forth. And it didn't do any of that. And the real shame is that we had the PPE, they let it go outdated and they threw it in the dumpster and weren't prepared. And the double whammy there was that all the production had moved offshore, so we couldn't even produce any.
We couldn't even create it. Like, this is what I don't understand. Presumably, if you had PPE stockpiled for use in a crisis, if its expiry date is 6 months hence, you take it out, you deliver it to institutions that are going to use it on a daily basis. Every hospital uses PPE every day, and fill it up. And you've got time to order it. Even if you've killed the manufacturing here, you've still got time to order it.
Yeah, that's not rocket science.
No.
It's just inventory management. So that's frustrating. And what I worry about, Pamela, and I think Canadians should be worried about now, that you start to think beyond vaccines, is pharmaceuticals in general.
Mm-hmm.
China manufactures most of our pharmaceuticals now. We have to address that. And Canada's not going to be able to manufacture all its pharmaceuticals in Canada. No. We should be thinking about, working with the US, because that's where a lot of the pharma companies have their big bases. Work with them, work with Europe, whatever. And we could actually develop a North American strategy for producing essential pharmaceuticals in North America somewhere, so that when, the crises hit, we're actually going to be able to have product. Because I wouldn't trust China on anything right now.
Yeah.
And I think most Canadians feel that way.
No, I think that's what's happened, which is it's been a very quick education on how vulnerable we have made ourselves by handing over production of many, many things. Pharmaceuticals are life and death. So that one we've got to take seriously. But if we just want to buy cheap goods in the big box stores, we're going to pay for that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Down the road.
Yeah,
they're cheaper on Tuesday, but when you don't have any, capability, do you think it's reasonable that we could develop a significant manufacturing presence here in Canada of pharmaceuticals, just for that backup system?
Yeah, I think so. In fact, Glaxo had a manufacturing facility in Mississauga. It was a major global manufacturing operation. A number of other companies did. Many of those facilities are gone now, but many of them have been sold off to other contract manufacturers in pharma. So actually, somebody just bought the Glaxo manufacturing facility in Mississauga. they're a contract manufacturer. The government of Canada go to them and say, what's your capabilities? Could we do a contract with you and get you to produce product A, B, and C, which are essential to our healthcare system? Something to that effect. The generic companies, which we favored for so many years in this country, why can't they do it? Why the ones that are off patent at least, and say, let's get a contract, and you have to ensure that under that contract you can produce these products at will. So do like we did on vaccines at Glaxo. So there's ways of doing this. There is manufacturing capability in Canada.
So when the next crisis hits, the next black swan, pandemic of some kind, your view is, having looked at all of this from your very particular vantage point, is do some stuff very quickly, like shut a border.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we had the intelligence network, shut the border. First of all, you set an objective and you say, next pandemic, this is what we want to achieve. First of all, we want to have domestic production of vaccines guaranteed within the first X number of months of the pandemic. Right. That's number one. Number two is that we want to, first of all, look around the world, see what's best practice. But let's say we want to be as good as Taiwan was this time. And what did they do? And what do we need to do? And part of that is closing the border. And part of our objective should be, we don't want to have to close down schools. We need to protect schools. We need to protect the economy. So what do we need to do that? What is it going to take? And then put a plan together and put that in place and then implement it, which we're not very good at.
It's kind of simplistic, but if we'd taken the hard call at the beginning, shut down the border and shut everything down for 2 to 3 weeks, we could have stopped this.
Yeah, we could have. Well, we could have made a huge dent in it. There's no doubt about that.
Agreed. That was stopping it. And what do we do now about the variants?
Well, I think the variants, I'm not too concerned about the variants, other than that you need to try and stop them from coming into the country. I mean, that's kind of the new stage of the pandemic. Let's not make the same mistakes we made before, letting it in the first place. Let's try and prevent them from coming in. So the travel issue is a real issue. And let's make sure we minimize that impact. I'm encouraged by what I hear from the vaccine manufacturers, and I know that right now they're effective against these variants, and they can make adjustments to the vaccine very easily to ensure that they are. So I think we're safe on the vaccine side, but prevention's better than having to treat it. So
two quick questions. The world was, I think, shocked by how quickly the vaccines were produced. At the same time, were we developing treatments?
Yeah, around the world, I think, I've been impressed by the number of treatments that have been under development by various pharmaceutical companies since this started. And what they've done is usually leverage work that were already done on viruses and so on. And, they've used that knowledge to kind of pivot into these products. So that's always key, is you need to be able to treat it too, not just prevent it, because some people are still going to get sick. So that does seem, if there's any silver lining in this, it does seem that the first vulnerable population that was hit continues to be the most vulnerable population, the elderly, particularly those trapped in long-term care facilities. Yeah. And, the reality is the long-term care facilities, I mean, right now for us, the only real way out is vaccination. And you've got to be able to vaccinate the people in there and the people going in there, because the other strategies are hard to implement. But
and do we know or do we not know whether having COVID actually means you are immune for some length of time?
No, we don't know that. There's a couple of things we don't know. One is that if you get COVID, you're not necessarily immune going forward. So they don't know the answer to that, but
yeah.
chances are you're probably not. I actually know a friend whose brother and his whole family have had it twice. So
Oh, really? Yeah.
there are incidences of that. The other one is once you get vaccinated, can you still spread it?
Right.
So we don't know the answer to that question either. So.
The one thing, and I just so appreciate all your time and information here, and maybe this is my own little hobby horse, but I don't understand why we've made testing so difficult.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. No, that was in another paper I wrote, and it was one of the points I was making is that for some reason Health Canada didn't want to approve those tests because but. And I have a huge problem with Health Canada. I mean,
yeah.
they are the slowest agency in the world. I've been involved with them in pharma, in vaccines, and in marijuana. So
yes, in your new job as a board member, yeah.
Yeah, and they are really difficult. And we can give them credit for approving Pfizer early, but that would have never happened if they didn't know the U.S. FDA was going to approve it the next day, which they did.
Right.
So. So on the testing, you use tests for two different things. First of all, diagnosis, and secondly, screening. And,
exactly.
The PCR test is important for diagnosis. It's the best test we have. It's good. And unfortunately, our technology, and we don't have the companies in Canada that could have done this. I was talking to somebody in Florida, and they said there's a place right around the corner from them that can do a PCR test in 24 hours. And they can get the results to them. So that's a rapid PCR test.
Yeah.
But the other rapid tests, you're not going to use those for diagnosis because there's too many false positives, negatives, whatever. They're not as accurate, but you can use them for screening. So we should have got those out into the marketplace so that we could use them for schools, for example. I mean, they were using them for
or essential workers that have to work on the subway system or at Walmart or Costco, or test them when they go into work.
Absolutely. I mean, they used them for the NBA and the NHL back a number of months ago, and it seemed to work pretty well for them. Why can't we use them? So I don't know. I don't get it. Health Canada was reluctant to approve them. I think that was a big mistake.
Well, for those of us who travel, I mean, even, a person going between Saskatchewan and Ottawa, for my own safety and that of people around me, I want to test before I go. I want to test when I land. I want to be able to say to people, yes, I've been on a plane and I've traveled from one province to another, but I'm fine. It's so difficult, and the results take 3, 4, 5, 6 days. Well, by that time, you might be on a plane back to where you came from.
That's right. Yeah. So that was, that's another part of the whole pandemic preparedness is your ability to test.
Yeah.
So that is, we think about going forward and we think about stockpiles and so on. We didn't have the PCR machines to do the kind of testing that needed to be done through this. So again, nobody was thinking about that.
Yeah. Well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about today. I'm not sure, that this is going to cheer anybody up, but I think if you don't name it, you can't fix it. So
yeah, I know, and I think people should kind of relax a little bit, realize that they're not going to get vaccinated till September, October. Most people, we're not going to get more than 6 million vaccines before the end of March. It isn't going to happen. And all this other information that's being thrown around is just diversionary. I mean, it's not really that relevant.
Just hunker down and stay as safe as you can and be at home if you can. And
realize that the federal government messed this up. And they can't do anything about it right now. All the calls to Pfizer, Moderna, or whatever else isn't going to make a difference.
Isn't going to change the movie. Well, I do hope that you continue to speak up so that when and if we are through this thing, we will really do a proper assessment so we're never, ever caught like this again. Really appreciate your insight on this, Paul. It's really Paul Lucas, from 25 years at GlaxoSmithKline, 16 of those years as CEO and president, and he's paying attention to this, and thank you for at least doing that and keeping us informed.
Happy to do it, Pamela. Thank you.
Okay, talk again soon. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. Bye-bye.
That's it for No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin today.